Hello dear students. In continuation with the classes which we started, now the today's session which we will be talking about is basically taking from the second paper, and we are talking about taking it from the part C, unit 5, in which the certain social movements have been there. When we started talking about the collective actions in political sociology, we talked about the transition from non-institutionalized to the institutionalized perspective, within which we looked at the social movement. We talked about the certain stages of the social movements, types of the social movements. So take the conceptual dimension from there. And now when we are looking at that in Indian context, the 5 movements which have been there, which somehow or other have their link with other dimensions as well. For example, when we are talking about the caste system, and the moment we start talking about the untouchability forms and perspectives, we will basically be coming to the realization that how today the term Dalit, which is providing a new search of identity, that has started emerging out. So in this very perspective, we will be talking about the Dalit movement and also the backward caste movements. You will also be linking that one with the caste conflict, which is there at the end of your syllabus. And when we talk about the agrarian society, rural agrarian structure of the Indian society that we talked about, and we looked at the transformation of that society as well. There I told you the 2 units which seems to be somewhere scattered, they are to be brought there. One is the agrarian class structure, and another is a peasant and a farmer movements. Today your major focus should be on the contemporary issues and the certain kind of concerns through which the farmer's agitation that has been talked about. When we talk about system of kinship, both in a paper 1 and paper 2, some idea of feminism, some idea of women movement, and what changes the women movement has brought, that would be understood by us. And in continuation with that one, once you have started talking about the women movement and its concerns in the broader global perspective, you also need to know about the concerns of the women movements in Indian context as well. And the 2 areas, which last class when I started talking about the political sociology, I said that any one of us who is talking about the regionalism, somehow or other this very son of the soil movement or a nativistic movement in which the local identity is promoted, and sometimes the violence which is being perpetuated against the perceived outsiders is basically the identity movements. And that identity movement will be using in terms of ethnicity and identity movements. And a basic understanding, conceptual understanding of the ethnicity has to be there as one of the dimensions of the social stratification. Look at this clarity of thought. Time and again from where we started, I said that it is not only knowing about sociology, not only becoming comfortable, but you must come to the stage of your preparation where conceptually you are not only very sound, but you also know how to link one unit with another. And then today, right from the global perspective to the Indian context, we have been finding about the environmental concerns. So environmental movement is there, and the same environmental movement will also be linked to the part C 7A, in which we are talking about the environmental concerns, sustainability. So do not wait that unit will be talked about there. This unit is here. We are talking about all these units. So the schedule which has been given, the schedule of the sessions which have been given, somehow or other they overlap with one another. That we have to understand it. And particularly now when we are coming to the Indian context, and when we started talking about the rural agrarian structure, and we started talking about that how the studies on peasantry or agrarian structure that has started in broader dimensions of sociology, in the broader perspective of sociology. And then when we come to the third world countries particularly, then we find about how the third world countries were basically the agrarian society, the peasant societies. And thus, in the study of rural agrarian structure, the concerns of the peasants, the concerns of the farmers, that also attracted the attention not only of the sociologists but also of the historians as well. In Indian society, somehow or other, we basically need to focus on one concept that is called continuity and change and continuity. So the very perspective of movements which we are talking about, and particularly if we talk about the peasant movements, then from the perspective of, or from the time of the Britishers till today, that continuity has to be talked about. Though the concerns may change, the issues may show their deviations. And in this very perspective, we basically needed to understand the peasant movements. Precisely in the peasant movement, the moment I was looking at, I find about the three areas or three movements seems to be the more important one, within which sometimes the questions have been there. Either in terms of Tebhaga, there was one question which I was looking at, Telangana movement, and post-independently one of the violent peasant movement, which is still vibrant in the Indian society, and almost no state seems to be untouched by this, is Naxalism. And from there you will be talking about the contemporary dimensions of this one. Have a broader conceptual clarity, have a broader issues in your mind. One reading is more than enough to understand the perspective. Some scholars in between from Tebhaga to the Naxalite, I'll just let you know who are to be used so that their findings could be there. And that way the things will be going about. And can I now say that when we are talking about the growth of the Indian sociology, though it has started having its focus on the urban societies, but since India was basically in a rural agrarian structure, rural agrarian society, thus historians, sociologists, they turn their equal attentions to the peasantry and the different concerns, related concerns with the peasantry. Every issues related with the peasantry was adequately understood, analyzed, and thus we find that when we are looking at the literature on the peasant studies or peasant movements in India, the concerns in India, that literature seems to be very wide, literature seems to be very rich. And the different scholars with their contributions have somewhere tried to enlarge, tried to provide a new kind of analysis to the peasant movements. The root of peasant movement in India can be traced back to the British colonial period. And precisely during the 18th and 19th century, the oppressive agricultural policies, exploitative taxations, exploitation and expropriation by the landlords, begar The certain issues, they somehow or other in the different parts of the country started the certain sporadic chit-put, sporadic incidences of the peasant unrest, which began from the smaller scale revolts, such as the Indigo Revolt, Coal Rebellion, Chota Nagpur, the organized movements like Champaran Satyagraha, Kheda Satyagraha, Bardoli Satyagraha, Tebaga movement, Telangana movement. However, the way in earlier British time it was said that anyone who is trying to analyze the Indian peasantry or particularly the peasant movement, it does not seem to be radical, it does not seem to be violent. Barrington Moore Jr. And if you look at his statement, he says somewhere where the Indian peasant movement is lacking the radical violent nature. But the moment in the mid-60s, we'll start looking at the culmination of the Naxalite movement, the emergence of the Naxalite movement, the Naxalite ideology. That very perspective that Indian movement, Indian peasantry has or movement has not been radical and violent, that myth has been eroded. And you will agree that out of all the movements which you are talking about, and particularly post-independently, the kind of violence, the intensity of violence what the Naxalite movement has generated, it seems to be the most important one. The Naxalism cannot be ignored. And peasantry in India, conceptually when you are looking at peasantry in India, it represents a very vast amount of landless agricultural laborers, sharecroppers, tenants, poor artisans, small and marginal cultivators. And thus, the issues may vary on the quotient of the different factors. The way in various time and space, the movements have occurred. The exploitative nature, denial of the labor and product, low wages, unpaid work, exploitation, excessive taxation, begar system. And in this very perspective, in a different time and space, we have find about how the peasant movements have occurred. And they have raised their concerns in terms of this one. But post-independently, when you are looking at either in terms of the land reforms or you talk about the rural transformation, steps toward the rural transformation, rural development, introduction of the new technologies, the green revolutions, the agriculture policies introduced by the successive governments, we have been finding that how the certain issues, the certain concerns, they have also emerged in that way. Even in the contemporary times, we find about that how the farmers, they have protested on the certain issues. The 3 agricultural bills which were introduced, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, I will not hesitate making this line, that the way the peasants of the country organized and sustained their protest for more than a year or nearby up to a year, which basically forced the government to repeal all these 3 agricultural laws, the sudden concerns have coming out. Though it is ironical that when we are talking about the movements, whatever the movement we are talking about, whatever the nature of the movement we are talking about, the new issues keep on cropping. And there has been a certain kind of lackluster approach in part of the authorities, in part of the government, to address only the immediate concern, not the overall concerns. It means the issues get accumulated. The cumulative character is there, cumulative nature is there. We are not trying to solve the problems right from the beginning, But the sudden movement comes out, the issues of injustice and other perspective protest emerges. The authorities address the immediate concerns, the protest is gone. And in this very perspective, conceptually if I say that just look at, make a table, radical movements and the contemporary movements. Let me give you the certain contemporary or the comparative analysis. When we look at the radical peasant movement, in which the mobilization was initiated for specific goals and against a specific class enemy. But today when we look at the contemporary peasant movement, the mobilization is initiated by the diversified groups for the diversified goals and not always against class enemy. If the radical movement was aggressive and hostile mobilization, then in a contemporary times the aggressiveness and hostility is limited within the given direction. So that way the comparison could be done. In a radical one, the mobilization was against all old norms and values. But today, the mobilization is for reforming of selected norms and the values. In a radical peasant movements, mobilization initiated by the political outfits reflecting a single ideological pursuit. But in a contemporary one, we find about it how some mobilizations have been supported by the political parties, but it reflects diversified political pursuit. If the radical movement was there to reckon the radical structural change, then in a contemporary peasant movement, the mobilization mostly for a structural stability and usually reformative in character. So that way, the radical and the peasant movements, contemporary peasant movements, that could be done about. In this very perspective, in a very brief, you try to talk about the Tebaga movement, Teen Bhag, which occurred during the 46-47 in the United Province of Bengal. The movement was initiated by the sharecroppers, aimed to retain 2/3 of agricultural product and to give only 1/3 to the jotedars, the landlords. Previously, the sharecroppers had to give half of their product, and they also had to work as a begar, unpaid work, without payment. Though when we are looking at the sociological works, it was said that yet another factor for the culmination of this Tebaga movement is the presence of the intermediaries. The movement was organized under the patronage and guidance of Kisan Sabha, which in a Calcutta session 1948 declared that sharecroppers can retain 2/3, and the slogan emerged that the land belongs to the tillers. This slogan has to be remembered because that will be there, which we talked about in terms of institutional approach. When we started talking about the sociological debate in terms of the land reforms, the first debate was an institutional perspective, that there should be radical reorganization of the ownership of the land. And there the slogan that has emerged out is the land belongs to the tillers. And when you look at the certain works, Hamza Alvi, he says that though initially it was a movement of middle class peasantry in which sharecroppers joined later on. This view of Hamza Alvi has also been supported by D.N. Danagre, but he argues that middle class did not participate actively. And why they did not participate actively? Because they received the benefits from the jotedars. And when we look at from the Marxist perspective and more precisely from the perspective of A.R. Desai, he argues that initially this movement emerged due to economic conflict, but later on acquired a political character in which the peasantry opposed the government and its various agencies. So some works you just attended. Just give the certain headings or certain more analysis. And if you want to go bit deep, so that you can say that in 1920s, with the formation of Communist Party of India, the Workers and Peasant Party 1922, Kisan Praja Party 1929, and the Bengal Kisan Sabha, all raised the slogan before the Land Revenue Commission that all Bargadars should be treated as tenants. The share should only be 1/3 instead of half. And ultimately in 1946, the Kisan Sabha passed a resolution that the sharecroppers can retain 2/3, and with the slogan that land belongs to the tillers. So that way, the Tebaga movement you can talk about. Telangana movement occupies an important place. Because you find about that how the Telangana movement in which that took place in erstwhile Hyderabad and which occurred in the mid of 1946 and continued almost for the 5 years. Operation Polo with the annexation of Hyderabad, you find about that how this movement and basically with the help of the Indian army that how this movement was suppressed. So from 1946 to 51 we will be talking about the Telangana movement. But when you say 1946 to 51, let's also not forget that in a different time period, different decades time and again, the demands for the separate Telangana has been raised, which ultimately subsided with a separate statehood status to the Telangana. The movement was initiated against the feudal system of rulers and the landowners, that is against the Nizam and his militia that is called Rajakas. In this context, Narayan Reddy argues that those similar conditions were prevalent in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, but an additional cause in this movement was the presence of Nizam. The agrarian social structure of Hyderabad emerged as a very oppressive during 1920s, and thereafter the condition of poor peasants and the tenants became pathetic. When we are looking at this Telangana movement, the Telangana National Congress, Andhra Jan Sabha or Sangam, Andhra Mahasabha raised the conditions of the poor or poor conditions of the peasantry. Right since, they have started talking about the poor conditions of the peasantry, pathetic conditions of the peasantry, right since 1930s. And later with the support of Andhra Communist Party, the movement intensified. Abolition of Betty system began, eviction of tenants, reduction of taxes, confirmation of Pakka rights, with the certain factors which ultimately culminated into political consciousness, mind the word, political consciousness among the peasants. The Hindu Mahasabha and later on Arya Samaj raised their dominance to oppose Majlis-e-Ittihad ul Muslimin, the organization of Hyderabad Muslims. By 1948, the movement grew to such an extent that the peasantry had established its own control over a large tract of land, indulging in guerrilla warfare. The peasants first started opposing the Rajakas by forming dalams, that is armed squads. The administrative machinery of Nizam came to a standstill, and in 1948 Hyderabad was annexed through the Operation Polo, and Indian government initiated army actions against CPI, which had adopted the path of armed struggle by planning a liberated zone. But the operation of army pressurized the CPI to call off the movement, and so that way from 1946 to 51, and time and again how the demands have been there. So you just quote the Narayan Reddy over there in terms of this one. But let me say that when we are either talking about the peasant movement and most violent peasant movement, you cannot understand the Indian peasant movement without Naxalite movement, which till date remains to be the most violent and the radical movements in the Indian soil, and precisely in the post-independent era. The certain hypotheses have also been related with this one, and this movement has somewhere refuted this very hypothesized idea of the certain British scholars that Indian peasantry had never been radical and violent. The movement which began from West Bengal spread to almost all parts of the country. And today no state seems to be untouched by the impact of Naxalism. Now the way the new young educated people have come out, and they have become the new ideologues, torchbearers of this movement. And that way today we are finding about the terms like urban Naxals. And thus, particularly the southeastern region, which is now being termed as a red corridor, we find about the intensity of Naxalite movement, and it is one of the greatest problem, internal security problem which we are talking about. So Naxalism we will also be talking about in terms of paper 3 in a GS. In few of the writings, Naxalism was linked with the land reforms, failure of the land reforms. Some linked it with its continuity with the ideology of the Telangana movement, that how the Dalam, the armed squad that was basically formed. And there also emerged a hypothesis that is Naxalite movement or Naxalism is somewhere, or as an attempt to destabilize the Indian democracy, as it has shown its external link, more precisely from Mao. So spring thunder of Maoism, it is also called to the Naxalism. In some of the writings, it was said that the very inculcation during the decades of 60s, we find about that how in the different parts of the globe, the certain educated youths, the students, right from America to Western Europe to Vietnam to jungles of Bolivia, in which the Che Guevara's guerrilla warfare will come out. Somewhere they say that this was basically 1960s is basically a period of new renaissance, in which the young educated ones, they have participated. Naxalism somehow or other related with this very phase of new renaissance. But we should not forget that though communism has become a part of history, it has started witnessing a change even in a country like China. But somehow or other this very communist dimension or communist ideology that is present in terms of or being continued in terms of the Naxalism, it still haunts us. Naxalism is an informal name given to the group representing revolutionary communism. And it was born out of the spirit of Indian Communist Party or communist movement on the Chinese and the Russian lines, in which the Chinese ideology of Maoism is the most prominent one. It owed its name Naxalbari, a small village in the then Darjeeling subdivision of West Bengal, where the CPI leaders like Charu Majumdar, Kanu Sanyal, Jagdal Oraon led a militant peasant uprising in 1967 with the aim to establish a revolutionary opposition in West Bengal. Charu Majumdar, being influenced by the philosophy of Mao, advocated that the peasant and lower class must overthrow the upper class and government, who are responsible for their miseries and plight. And I will not forget quoting one of the statement of Charu Majumdar, that Naxalism is a premeditated stone thrown in the calm water of Indian democracy, the ripples of which will be echoed in the coming future. And that very statement seems to be true when we are looking at the contemporary scenario, in which we find about that almost every state somewhere seems to be affected by the Naxalite movements and the Naxalism, ideology of Naxalism. And there is a one work that we need to basically talk about in terms of Partha Mukherjee. While analyzing the Naxalite movement, he says that the intensity in composition of leadership and a very well-built cadre, what the Naxalism has created, is a sufficient reason not to dismiss the phenomena, and its continuity has to be talked about. You just go through the certain history, you will be finding about in terms of that how West Bengal State Land Acquisition Act, and that way we find about the certain Charu Majumdar hypothesis, how in one of the incident the cop was killed, the rural leaders were arrested, and the debate also emerged out that is India ready for such kind of violent uprisings, and that way we find about the certain division. So these are the certain background in which the Naxalite movement will be talking about. And particularly when we are looking at today, poverty, indebtedness, illiteracy, underdevelopment, infrastructural deficiency, caste violence, high-handedness of police and administration, are some of the reasons for the persistence of this movement. Particularly in MP, we find about how the Salwa Judum, that movement has emerged out. Mahendra Singh Karma, the late Mahendra Singh Karma, from where we find about how Salwa Judum, on which the Supreme Court observation, the Honorable Supreme Court has also observed it. Operation Cobra is now going on. And in this very perspective, I cannot say that Naxalite movement has come to an end. Yes, that very violent phase which we are talking about in terms of the early leadership of Charu Majumdar, who died in a police custody, and particularly at the time of Siddharth Shankar Ray, we find about that how it was basically subdued to a certain extent. But the ideology still remains, and that has surfaced, and that has now percolated to each and that has spread to each and every state of the country. And it has started showing its link with the external actors as well. And it has emerged as one of the greatest problems of internal security in India. When you go to the home site page of Ministry of Home, you find about that how the certain pages would be there. You will find about the certain declaration, the certain recognition of the areas as the extremist zone, and what the government is basically doing it. But it is also true that somehow or other in some of the writing now we have started emerging out, that when we started talking about the Naxalite movement which emerged due to the lack of developmental activities, lack of the people's participation, today a different kind of political narratives is also emerging out. It has taken an anti-developmental stand. The exploitation of the villages has just started emerging out. So the political overtone behind the Naxalism that cannot be overruled today. And in this very perspective, they may ask you the contemporary perspectives. But it's ironic that when we look at most of the time, I'm sorry to say this line, most of the time when I look at the contemporary farmers movement, somehow or other it seems to be initiated by the rich farmers. And in this, the middle class and the rich farmers, they have always led and provided their leadership, and they have provided to guide the contemporary farmers movement. If earlier the small, marginal, exploited farmers were the change agent who wanted to be the catalyst of change, today most of the movements are, farmers movements are basically being led by the middle class and the rich peasantry who wants to be beneficiary of that one, not the change agent. Particularly particularly in a democratic setup, when you're finding about that how somehow the poor policing, inadequate law, inept implementation, the political mobilization that is started emerging out, and more precisely in the green revolution belt from Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, you finding about that the major chunk of the support is coming from there. So the issues which are coming out in terms of parity in prices, subsidies, waiver of loans, establishment of Kisan banks, and then we find about that how entry of the private parties, security of the minimum support price, opening of the market, opposition to the entry of the private parties. These are the certain issues within which the contemporary farmers' movements are going on. And particularly, right from Mahendra Singh Tikat to Sharad Joshi in Maharashtra to today's contemporary farmers' movement, which is continued for a year, a certain kind of political legitimacy crisis to the elected government was also brought it. But the movement which basically was raised by the certain concerns of the farmers, it also started generating a support from outside, and that way external internal linkage that was witnessed. You pick up these dimensions and just look at the contemporary pigeon movements. I am giving the broader perspective within which the movements could be looked at. I told you, and I will be talking about that one when we are talking about the patriarchy and others. I will be giving the certain dimensions in which the women movement that has to be talked about. So in the system of kinship, I will be devoting some time to make you understand the feminism, to make you understand some of the questions which has come from there. Like you find about the questions on terms of the patriarchal bargain, such kind of questions come out. So you need to know. They are not the offbeat questions, they are basically in the track questions. Now in the contemporary movements or anywhere we are talking about, either in a global perspective or in the Indian context, one of the most important movement has been the women movement. And when we talk about the women movement, in Indian sociology, the women movement has been adequately represented by both the male scholars as well as the female scholars. And it has witnessed, like the Western counterparties also witnessed, the transition from androcentric to gynocentric, male-dominated one to the women-centered one. How the feminism in the Western perspective that basically talked about the social, economic and political equality between sexes. These are the certain issues that has been prime concerns everywhere in the women movement. But looking at the nature of the Indian society, the pervasive patriarchal ideology and a certain kind of moral guardianship which we have initiated toward the women, some the newer kind of perspective, the newer kind of issues will also be added that one. The challenges associated with the women's life in India or the life cycle of Indian women. Sometimes I always say that despite the rise of feminism, despite the changes, despite the transformation toward the modernity, it is also a fact that the entire life cycle of women today reflects certain challenges right from conception to the old age. So the issues, some issues may be a newer one within which the women movement that has to be talked about. A women movement in India, just wait for a day so that I can talk about the system of kinship and I'll give you the broader perspective on feminism. But I do request here that today in a brief whatever we are talking about the certain issues of the women movement in India, and I'll be quoting some of the scholars, you also wait for the certain basic understanding of yours in a feminism and women movement in the Western context. So I'll let you know, I'll be talking about it, what I have talked about. When we look at the Indian society right from the early ages, historically, the feminine force has always been recognized in the Indian society. And since thousands of years, this feminine force and its recognition has been part and parcel of the Indian tradition. The idea of the Shakti, the female figurines in a Harappa, or the worship of the female goddesses during the Vedic times, and even when we come to the medieval age in terms of bhakti movements, how the women saints like Mirabai rose to the prominence, and they are still revered in the Indian society. It means the feminine concerns has been a theme in the Indian society and traditions in a civilizational history of the country. But when you talk about the movement, then in a true sense, the women movement in India finds its expression during the colonial period, in which the concept of westernized women emerged. However, say westernized women, then a certain kind of juxtapose, certain kind of dichotomy also emerged. At one hand, we want the Indian woman to be westernized, but on the other hand, there was a sword hanging on the head of the Indian woman. That is an image of an ideal Indian woman. Now, these are the two. At one hand, you want the Indian woman to be westernized, and you also, on the other hand, you have a certain kind of moral obligation of an ideal Indian image of ideal Indian woman. So there emerge a certain kind of contradiction, there emerge a certain kind of conflicting demands, in which the notion of Brahminical patriarchy played an important role. You might have gone through the Pandit Ramabai, who has rejected the Brahminical patriarchy. When we look at the women movement, basically, in general too, India, the three waves will become the more important one. Though sometimes we are now debating on the fourth wave movement. In Indian context, when you are looking at the first wave movement, which began in the 19th century social reform movements and continued till the national freedom movement. However, you need to look at for your own conceptual understanding, divide that into three phases. This should be there from where the certain questions on the GS paper 1 has been asked to you. In reference to Gandhiji, the change of the role of the Indian women in the national freedom in reference to Gandhiji. Such kind of questions have come out, for which you do not have to prepare anything. Your sociological knowledge is more than enough to solve the questions of the first paper GS and second paper, in terms of where the welfare and other kind of perspectives comes out. So when I say, when I am looking at the first wave movement of India, starting from the 19th century social reform movements to extending to the national freedom movement, in which the first phase was basically androcentric in character. I am sorry, but this is a fact that you need to understand. When I say androcentric in character, it means most of the women's issues were raised by the males. The modern looking, the educated one, influenced by the Western kind of education. The reformers like Ram Mohan Roy, Keshav Chand Sen, they all influenced by the modern ideas of equality and emancipation. So that they raise the concerns of women's life, the issues related with the women's life, like sati, widow remarriage, child marriage. Women's education. And it also somewhere not only restricted to the Hindus, but from there, I will talk about the Begum of Bhopal and others, we find about that how it also extended to the Muslim community, and the women's education was highlighted. But the second phase, right from Sarojini Naidu to Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay to any basis, the phase which you are talking about. That was the second phase in the first wave movement, which was basically the issues, the women's issues were raised by the women's. Either in terms of the political participation, voices against the social evils, entitlements. These all issues were raised by the females now. This is the second phase. But this very first wave movement witnessed a very quantitative qualitative change with the emergence of Gandhiji, who had urged every Indian to take part in the national freedom movement as a religious mission. The idea surfaced that Gandhiji is sent, and large number of women participated in the national concerns of the Gandhiji. The women's leaders like Sarojini Naidu, Annie Besant, Kamala Nehru, Hansa Mehta, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Begum of Bhopal, Madam Cusin, they came out in open and participated, mobilized the Indian women to participate in the call of the Gandhiji. However, this women's leadership that we are talking about that emerged at the nationalist stage from a very small section of urban middle classes who had raised their concerns on equal voting rights, political participation, reformation of personal laws, banning of social evils, and particularly after the First World War, the organizations like Indian Association, Women's Indian Associations emerged along with the National Council of Women in India, All India Women's Conference. Local and regional organizations started emerging out, which polarized the women's participation and the issues. And for this, Maitri Chaudhary, she writes that women's participation in the struggle for freedom developed their critical consciousness about their roles and rights in an independent India. However, it also a fact that all this women's participation that has taken place, all the leadership that has emerged out, somewhere deep down, they had thought that once India gets independence, women's issue would be politicized. However, after independence, nation building got the priority. And once the nation building got the priority, the women's issues relegated behind. For which the women leaders are also to be blamed, in the sense that most of them became part of the government or the provincial government. So the active raising of the voice that was gone, since they were the part of the government. And in this very perspective, from 1947 till 1960s, the women movement in India was dormant. And if I quote Dipti Priya Malhotra and Gail Ombit, they make the line that from 1947 till 1960s, Indian women movement was dormant in character. Constitutionally, though, the equal rights were granted to the women, legal measures were initiated. But however, individuality of women was not expressed. It is not so that women's concerns were not thought of, but her individuality was somewhere lacking. And thus in this context, if I could quote Rekha Mehra, who has analyzed the CDP, Community Development Program, she says women's concerns were thought of, but it was to make Indian women a better mother and a better wife. When you say it was to make Indian women a better mother and better wife, it means the difference between person and individual has not been established. Her identity has not been thought individually, her identity has been thought in a social context. Mridalini Gore, Ahilya Ranade, in the late 50s, they raised the concern that unpaid work is no work. And I still find that this very slogan, unpaid work is no work, justifies the condition of a majority of the housewives in the Indian society. And thus, during the 60s, the second wave movement emerged, and the Indian movement, dissatisfied with the status quo, collaborated together. And they opposed the patriarchy, as patriarchy was considered to be the root cause of the female subordination. And with the second wave, when the women has opposed the status quo, the conservatism attacked patriarchy. Then they basically tried to find equality, justice, emancipation within the oppressive, pervasive, patriarchal dimension. Here I will be quoting about, here can I talk about Leela Dubé's metaphor of seed and earth, Sherry Ortner's nature versus culture, women to men. So that way we are finding about that question was there in terms of seed and earth, that how the very pervasive patriarchal power in general in South Asian context and particularly Indian context that denies the right of Indian women on her own children. So that way comparing women with that of the earth on which the seed has to be sown, and that way we are finding about such kind of questions have come out. So there you can quote about the Leela Dubé, which I will be quoting about in terms of patriarchy and others. But particularly in the decades of 70s, mid 70s if I say, the third wave movement emerged out. Reports towards equality, with the publication of that one, a new kind of uneasiness that has started emerging among the women scholars as well. Women movement found its reappearance. And if I could quote Neera Desai, she says that with the publication of this towards equality report in 1975, it sent shockwaves and acute sense of unrest among the women and also among the teachers, researchers, political activists, and thus they highlighted on the action, intervention and consciously raising the concerns of the women. In this context, Punacha writes that at the heart of the women's studies is the political commitment to social change and growth, and thus from here the question could be raised here, and thus 1970s emerged as a period of enthusiasm and which tried to understand the root of women's subordination. The women scholars that tried to search the regions in the aspects of biology, socialization, division of labor, property, production, reproduction, thereby relating it to the theoretical perspectives of liberal, radical, Marxist and socialist ideologies. Though each of these may differ on the blueprint of actions, when you look at the types of the feminism, but they had an agreement pertaining to the subordinate position of women in a society. And thus, every types, they saw the competing stands, they tried to address the women's issues on their own way. Either relating that with the biology or relating with the patriarchy or relating that one in terms of class, relating that one with the culture or tradition. So somewhere their explanatory perspectives may differ, but there was one common dimension on which they basically raised the concerns, that was to talk about the women's subordination. Maitri Chaudhary, she argues that if the women's movement prior to 1975 revolved issues like sati, child marriage, widow remarriage, women's education, suffering and inequality, then post 1975 the new issues like violence, rape, cases of dowry, harassment, death, gender inequality, gender based unequal development, political participation, they became important. It is the same period within which the Chipko movement came out, so through which we will be finding about the questions of ecofeminism, Gaura Devi's role, you might be aware of there. It is the same period, 1972, we will be finding about that how Ila Bhatt, she initiated organizing the women in our unorganized sector, in which the Seva will come out, self-employed women's association. So this is a very important phase, the third wave movement, the phase, the decades of 70s seems to be the most important one. And in the 80s we find about the common concerns of the women developments started emerging out, and that way we find about the certain words, transition, WAD, women and development, WID, women in development. And when we come to the decades of 90s, we will find about it another slogan, WED, women empowerment and development. And today we are basically talking about WEED, WEED, women empowerment, environment and development. And particularly after the sixth five-year plan, for the first time, the government included a chapter on women and development, and several working groups were set up by the Planning Commission, Ministry of Rural Development and the Department of Education, to look at the issues of women employment, literacy, and village level organizations started emerging out. Questioning of the androgynous explanations, that has also started coming out. They raised their concerns of the public-private dichotomy. And particularly right from the patriarchy to the entitlements to the equality, the law, education, health, every issues that started emerging out. The perspective of GAD, gender and development, that became the more important one. And in the 90s, the inequities between women and men were raised. And particularly gender and development, Mohanty and Mahajan argue that GAD approach encompassed equity and empowerment approach. And from 90s, the concept of empowerment gained currency. It was different from the welfare, development and equity approach, since it gave consideration to the practical needs of women and transforming the social structure to give a space to the women. In a five-year plan, empowerment of women was emphasized. National Commission of Women was established in 1992. And in the same year, Panchayati Raj Act was enacted with a provision in which now we are looking at the provision of 1/3 seats being reserved for the women. And year 2001 was declared as Women's Empowerment Year. You can also talk about the how from the decades of 90s, a new assertion that started emerging out, that you could talk about in the women movement, the Dalit movement. That is, the Dalit women's organizations started coming out. That how, if I talk about Dietrich, he writes that how the Dalit women have been the target of upper class violence and were treated property by the Dalit men. We will be having its link. I'll just let you know when I'll come to the types of feminism, that how it will be showing its link with the black feminism. So these are the certain issues we talk about, and look at the certain issues today in terms of the equal remuneration, equal pay, safe transportation, safe working space, pause, all right, Me Too movements, all right. You just raise certain concerns, and within which you will be finding about the contemporary issues of the women. But if there is any question on the violence, you look at the violence, dowry, such kind of questions should be there. And do not restrict the looking at the challenges with the women of only the adult women. Whenever such kind of questions comes out, the challenges, then look it from the perspective of the conceptions, misuse of technologies, all right, sex selections. So you talk about from there, and you'll find about the certain kind of terms in a population we'll be talking about, all right. And how from 2011 we'll be finding about that how the developed states of India, there we find about the misuse of technologies, all right. And in these dimensions, look at the certain issues and the women movements in terms of the three. Though there has been debate from 2012, particularly the rape case, the body shaming, such very issues were raised. But broadly, when we are looking at the feminist kind of debate, which you find about that they doubt whether this could be termed as a fourth phase or not. So the first phase, second phase, third phase, 80s, talk about the government initiatives, and that way the Indian movement has to be talked about. But let me say one thing. Keep an eye on the nature of questions and make a mental synopsis that if such kind of questions come up, think on that line. And do link it when we will be talking about in brief on the feminism. So the certain data will be given over there, in which we will be talking about the certain works from the new work that will start emerging out. So you just keep an eye and link it that one, so that the movement will be talked about this one. Just give me 2 minutes. I'll begin with the Dalit movement and others. Today we'll talk about the movements. Easier one to understand it, not much. So it is easier. And while listening the video, please do remember some of the names which I use and jot down that one, so that if you remember, it will provide the sociological perspective to that one. So just give me 2 minutes, I'll begin that one. This is long, which I wanted to share with you people. Then the second paper, sometimes I look at it, and this is only because that I want you in this 55-60 hours, that particularly in the second paper you should not miss the certain names, the Indian scholars. And now when we are looking at this very perspective in the movements apart from these two, then anyhow, if we could have talked about the caste system, we could have talked about the Dalit and the backward caste movements. And more or less whatever the conceptual clarity which I have developed while talking about the untouchability forms and perspectives. Then let me say that any one of us, whosoever is talking about the caste system, we cannot ignore the presence of the untouchables. We cannot ignore the presence of the scheduled caste today. And right from the historical perspectives, when you are looking at the emergence of the caste systems, either in terms of the Varna combination permutations, in terms of Anuloma and Pratiloma, we find about the genesis of certain castes. We find about the emergence of a category that is called Chandala. Thus, in a social stratification, particularly when you started looking at the organized societies, in almost every organized society, there has been a category which has been placed lowly in the hierarchy. And when you look at this very provision of social stratification in Indian context, in which the caste system becomes important, we find about a lowly category which has been referred by the different names in a different historical periods. Chandala, to the Shudra, to the Ati Shudra, to the Nama Shudra, to the exterior caste, untouchables. And particularly after the independence, the political administrative dimension emerged out, and in which the term that was basically used was called scheduled caste. And if I could quote Dr. Ambedkar, and he says that who are the scheduled castes? He says the scheduled castes are the ex-untouchables. But of late, they prefer the term Dalit. And that is basically a search of a new identity. That is basically a search of alternate structure. It is a positive prioritization. Though in the same Dalit kind of perspective, we find about in some of the works how the word subaltern is being used, in which Ranjit Guha's perspective will be coming out. In the post-colonial perspective, that how this term subaltern that has started emerging out, which is an attempt to look history from below. And it is also a refutal that the masses do not have the creativity to create their own history. So this is the basic background within which the term Dalit will be coming out. And all these stigmas which is related, that way we will be basically talking about the Dalit movements. But let me just say that when we are talking about the Dalit movement, you just try also to imagine certain questions. Like the questions could be there, the questions have been there from Jyotiba Phule, questions have been from there from the E.V. Ramaswamy, the self-respect movement. The questions have been there in terms of comparison between Gandhiji and Dr. Ambedkar. So when we are talking about broadly the four corners, Jyotiba Phule, Gandhiji, Dr. Ambedkar, E.V. Ramaswamy, their views pertaining to the conditions of untouchability backward classes, Dalits, that will become the most important one. But it is also ironical. I don't know whether I should make the statement or not. It's also ironical that today this same category for whom Gandhiji has fought, Gandhiji has raised the concerns, it seems that somehow or other they are forgetting the contribution of Gandhiji. And thus the ideological triangulation that comes out, made up of the views of Mahatma Phule, Dr. Ambedkar and E.V. Ramaswamy, Naikar. This ideological triangulation now seems to be the major base within which the new kind of political consciousness which is emerging among the Dalits, that has to be talked about. Today, a new kind of political consciousness, new kind of consciousness is emerging out. New kind of Varna consciousness is revisited, in which we need to talk about the emerging Dalit consciousness and questions of identity. But Dalit is not a caste in which one is born into. Rather, it is a category in which identity is basically established vis-a-vis another. And this identity of the Dalits is also based on the cultural experiences of them. So identity seems to be constructed. And in this very perspective, when we are talking about, thank you, bhai. When we are talking about, just let me take the, either you talk about Andhra Bete, you talk about Gelamvat, you'll be finding about that how the new Varna consciousness is emerging out, in which the Dalit consciousness, Dalit assertiveness, Dalit identity that would be coming out. So you just give the brief in terms of the emergence of the term Dalits, the ideological triangulation, and particularly the kind of political activism that has now started emerging out. The kind of consciousness that has started emerging out. The differential mobilization that is taking place among the Dalits. Now they are questioning the old orthodox Brahminical doctrines. And this questioning of the Brahminical, orthodox Brahminical doctrines is basically a search of a new identity. And in search of this new identity, they have basically started a new constructive method. And this new constructive method is not based on any kind of negative construction. It is basically having the positive identity. And thus, if I could quote Samuel J. Kumar, he argues that Dalit is not a negative term. Rather, it is a positive symbol of identity of the exploited category in which the question of origin and history are being solved. So Dalits have rejected the Brahminical authoritarianism, and somewhere this movement has flawed on the lines, on the secular lines. Materialistic worldview, not the ritualistic worldview. The political, economic kind of dimension seems to be the more important one. However, overall, when we are looking at this, then we also need to look at the statement of Yogendra Singh. His view that Dalit movement has not been very successful in northern and central India, as it has been successful in southern India. The Dalits have mostly asserted themselves on the secular lines, reflecting somewhere the materialistic worldview. And therefore, any one of us whosoever is looking at the Dalit movement or backward caste movement, we basically needed to analyze these movements in the broader social structure of the Indian society, in the broader social structure of the caste system. And when I say either in terms of the broader social structure of the caste system, then we should not forget that this broader structure of Indian society is based on the value paradigm of inherited inequality. I repeat, which is based on the value paradigm of inherited inequality, in which birth is a biologization factor and caste was and is an elaborate system of biologization of social order. Thus, Dalit movement is not only the search of new identity, but also the creation of an alternate structure in which they will construct their own identity, they will construct the newer kind of assertiveness, the newer kind of consciousness among them, different from that of the Brahminical ideology. And thus, if I could quote A.R. Desai says that the Dalits have rejected the ideas of karma, punya, janma, moksha by considering caste ideology to be a Brahminical myth. However, when you look at the work of Ghanshyam Sir, he says it is nothing but Dalit movement is basically a political agenda. The perspective of from the Marxist perspective, the new emerging consciousness and the contradictions have been raised by the Gay Lombet. However, the contemporary scholars, if you look at the work of Vivek Kumar, who is talking about how the various political parties have provided a new leadership to the Dalits, and if the Dalit leadership gets a hold on state administration for a longer time, there would certainly emerge a structural change in society. Today the Dalits are not ashamed of their identity, and they are registering any sort of exploitation and discrimination melted towards them. Collectivity has emerged out, and collectivity, a new kind of political activism is emerging out. They are opposing every kind of discrimination, every kind of wrongdoings, which though many a times has also led to violence. And from there you can talk about the caste violence, in which you can talk about the Panikar, you can talk about the Bose, Upadhyaya, Yagnik. These are the certain works which are basically focused on the caste conflict. And particularly also raise the concern that how upper caste versus Dalit, that kind of rivalry and the caste violence that is on the rise. So that would be there in terms of the caste violence. But do trace in terms of untouchability, come to the terms of Dalit, try to find out, relate that one with the certain works of the Gandhis and others. You will also be finding about it how they have been compared with one another. Self-respect movement will be coming out. There has been a question in terms of Mahatma Phule. So in terms of talking about the untouchability, basically, in a caste system, I'll be just giving you the hint of these four scholars so that the certain movement should be talking about. But once you have done that one, apart from this one, it at another dimension that seems to be the most important one, has been basically the backward caste movement. And particularly I said that you need either you are talking about the backward caste movement or either you are talking about in terms of the Dalit movement. It has to be basically viewed in the broader structure of Indian society. And that broader structure of Indian society, which basically reflects the value paradigm of inherited inequality, biologization fact, biologization of caste. So in this very perspective, the similar dimensions will be coming out. Ascriptive nature of the caste, that has been one of the important feature. And it is still persist. So you look at this dimension and start from there, take the continuity from the Dalit to the backward caste movement. And a good number of works have been done in terms of Ghanshyam Saha has extensively worked not only on the new forms of untouchability but also has also worked on the backward caste movement, the movements of the lower castes. In a popular use, all those castes who do not belong to Dvija category, twice born, are referred to as a backward caste. Though in a various sociological works reveal that in the different parts of the country, there are many castes who though are not Dvija, twice born, but do not consider themselves to be backward, since they have managed a substantial control on economic and political power, economic and political resources. Thus, sometimes it becomes difficult to provide an informal socio-economic condition in the analysis of the backward caste. You need to remember one name, that is M.S.A. Rao, who highlighted three categories in the backward caste movement. The higher group of backward caste who are landlords like Jats, Ahirs, Gujars, Marathas. Number two, those castes who are sharecroppers, artisans and other service castes like Koli in Gujarat, Vedar in South India, who relate themselves with the Hindu caste. And the third category is the untouchables, who are referred to as scheduled caste constitutionally and now who prefer the term Dalits. So we talked about the Dalit perspective. So in a backward caste, the Dalit dimensions will also be coming out. M.S.A. Rao also highlights or outlines, divides the backward caste movement in four categories. Movement of the high non-Brahmin caste like Marathas in Maharashtra, Reddys in Tamil Nadu, Vokaligas in Mysore. Then number two, the non-Brahmin caste who are in between the Dvija and the lower caste like Ahirs and Kurmi in Bihar, Koli in Gujarat, Mali in Maharashtra, Nonia in Punjab, and movements by untouchables, that is we are talking about the Dalit movement. And he includes movement by the tribals within the backward caste as well. Though the debate would be there in terms of the tribe versus caste. So we are talking about the tribe caste continuum from Surjit Sinha's perspective. I will be raising that concerns when we are talking about the tribals. Gail Ombit argued that the non-Brahmin movement of Maharashtra combines elite-based conservatism and mass-based radicalism. Whereas Rudolph uses the term Dalit, the cattle capitalists for the Yadavas, whose mobility in the political scenario, particularly in northern belt, has initiated new polarization, particularly in the last few decades. Earlier, the backward classes related themselves with the process of Sanskritization, but today, the ritual perspective of Sanskritization has given way to the secular trend. In southern India, particularly in Tamil Nadu, the emergence of anti-Brahminical movement initiated the new process of mobility in which Naikar's role is most significant, that self-respect movement. And particularly in almost all parts of the country today, the caste associations have emerged, caste federations have emerged, who are not only protecting the interest of that particular caste, but they are also initiating the reformative actions toward that one. And these associations are also working as a medium for the political mobilization. And thus these associations are basically acquiring a formal character. The one fact that has to be talked about, and if I look at from the perspective of Andhra Bete and others, you find about that when we are looking at the northern India, the nature of the most of the movements are multipolar. Within the periphery of the caste ideology. But the moment you compare the movements of the northern India with that of the southern and Maharashtra, that central region, the nature of the backward caste movement is basically bipolar, anti-Brahminical one, thereby reflecting the bipolar character. And also, it is also true that today the backward class have emerged as a pressure group reflecting a new assertiveness, a new identity, which has often led to the caste conflict and a violence. So that way you talk about M.S. Rao, we talk about Gail Ombet, you talk about Rudolph, you talk about Andhra Bete in terms of northern and southern, right from Samuel Jayakumar to Vivek to Yogendra Singh to Ghanshyam Shah. Remember few names. I know that you, in this shorter span of time while listening to the videos, you may miss few, but I hope you remember few so that you could provide a support, sociological support to your answers. So that way, when we talk about the caste structure, when we talk about the social certificates in India, in which we will be talking about the caste structure, and more precisely when we are talking about the untouchability, the certain dimensions of Dalit and a backward caste would also be emerging out, which we will be talking about, and so that I will let you know that day that how we have talked about the Dalit movement and caste perspective. So that way you can talk about that dimensions. The two other movements that have been important one, the one is basically the ethnicity and identity movements. Take out the basic data of yours, basic knowledge of yours in terms of ethnicity from the social stratification, then how it is derived from the ethnic word, the Greek word ethnos or ethnikos, meaning a nation, race or large number of people having common trait in customs or groups. Sociologically, ethnicity can be defined as a historically formed aggregate of people having a real or imaginary association with a specific territory, a shared cluster of beliefs and values, containing its distinctiveness in relation to the similar groups. Thus, we are looking at the certain definitions broadly. I am not talking about indifference. I do not go for this one. Broadly, when we are talking about the definitions of the ethnicity, when you analyze all the definitions, the 5 elements out of all the definitions can be underlined. And the first one is a subjective belief in a real or assumed historical anecdotes. Then the number 2, a symbolic or real geographical center. The third element would be shared cultural emblems such as biological origin, language, history, religion, which provide a certain base for identity. Fourth element is the self-ascribed awareness of distinctiveness and belonging to a group. And the fifth one is recognition by the others of the group differentiation. Particularly when we are looking at the movements, then from the decades of 70s, ethnicity acquired a strategic significance in sociological anthropological tradition, and most precisely in the post-colonial geopolitical scenario, ethnicity occupied a distinct place, a different kind of perspective. The way the ethnic monetary activism started in the different parts of the globe, so it acquired a certain kind of a strategic significance, and thus the sociological attention turns toward that one. Frederick Barth, you might have gone through in terms of the social stratification while talking about the ethnicity. I just give you the reference. So he says that the ethnic group refers to that population which is largely biologically self-perpetuated, which share cultural values and unity in cultural forms, which makes up a field of communication and interaction, membership with which it identifies itself, and is also identified by others as containing distinguishing category or identity. And thus you will be talking about the race versus ethnicity. If the race reflects biological endowments, then ethnicity can be perceived in terms of origin, history, religion and culture. The ethnic affiliations are even used to designate nations or nationality, in which if a state refers to political if the state refers to political-legal dimension, the nation connotes psycho-cultural perspective. Just give me 2 minutes so that you just listen it. The sociologists have developed the 3 competing approaches to understand ethnicity. We'll be using that one. Try to use that one in terms of the movements. The primordialist approach, which views ethnic identity based on deep primordial attachment to a group or culture. Primordial मतलब basic feature जो हो गया. The second approach is instrumentalist approach, in which ethnicity is perceived as a political instrument. Can I use that one in terms of son of the soil movement, the nativistic movement, emerging identity movement in India? Can you say that this could be approach from the instrumentalist approach? So this is basically exploited by the politicians for their own gain. Look at same line I was talking about. And the third one is basically called constructions approach, which is a fluid concept made in a specific and historical context. The sociological works have also tried to analyze ethnic movements in terms of resource mobilization theory, cultural deprivation theory, ethnocentric expressions resulting into insider versus outsider. Socio-economic concerns have also been talked about. Thus, broadly we are talking about the sociologically, ethnic identity movements, ethnic conflict, and even communalism can be cited as ethnic expression. Communalism is an example of ethnic movement. But all ethnic movements are not communal. You need to remember this line. That communalism is an example of ethnic movement, but all ethnic movements are not communal. When you talk about the sub-nationalist or semi-autonomous movements, including the tribal insurgency, particularly in the northeast where the tribal identity and uprising that is coming out, these all could be brought within the ethnic movements. And it is true that when we look at the Indian society is a diversified society, is a diverse society. This diversity has basically talked about the identities to be sustained. Last class I was talking about that when I talk about the post-independently and when I talk about the march toward the democracy, when the constitution emerged as a safeguard of rights, providing the rights, protecting it, then I had told you that the constitution has never asked us to relinquish our previous identity. Becoming a Bihari, Tamilian, Kannad, Malayalam, it is not a hindrance to be an Indian. We are first something else, then we are Indian. And becoming something else is not an hindrance to be an Indian. Thus we talked about integrative approaches, salad ball approach in terms of the unity and diversity, opposite to that of the melting pot approach or melting pot model. And when you talk about ethnicity and identity, this line could be remembered, that the previous identity has not to be relinquished to be an Indian. And this very ethnic identity is being carried and it is still being reflected when you are looking at the contemporary socio-economic and political dimensions of the country. The language, religion, reason, caste, they all basically somehow or other operating within the ethnic concerns. The ethnic movements can be viewed in terms of linguistic identities, which is still considered to be one of the strongest expression finding in the Indian socio-political structure. Linguistic reorganization of a state was done by the Faisal Ali. We find about how the opposition of Hindi, and even today when you are looking at the 3-language formula. So the ethnic movements which are looking in the line of ethnicity, the first dimension you can pick up that in terms of the linguistic identities. Religion is at another dimension through which the ethnic movement has to be talked about. And the religious classes in terms of communalism has been a stark reality in the post-independent era as well. And even today, the religious identity, the religious bipolarization that could be witnessed. And somehow or other, the same meaning of communalism, that religions are incompatible, which was at the British time shown in terms of bipolar model, has now taken a multipolar character. This very ideology of incompatibility between religion still continues in the Indian scenario. And this very feeling that ethnic identity which is emerging out of the religion, it is somewhere not only threat to the broader nationalism, it is also thwarting the process of modernization in the Indian context. So apart from the linguistic, the religion dimension that could be talked about, an ethnic movement you could also talk about in terms of the tribal identity, tribal resurgence, in terms of the ethnic movements, in which the concerns of identities is consistently being used. In the different parts of the country, when you look at the certain formation of the states, the tribal identity we are talking about, either we are talking about Jharkhand or if we are talking about in the northeast, the canvas of ethnic conflict, the ethnic identity which is being raised by the tribals, that has also to be raised, and son of the soil kind of perspective that is emerging out. Assam, again the illegal migrants, demands of autonomy in Bodoland, Gorkhaland, the hatred towards the Bengalis, the Marwaris, the intruders from Bangladesh, Myanmar, or again the non-Assamese Muslims. So many a times, this very concerns of the tribal identity, tribal concerns have been raised, which would be yet another dimension through which we will be looking at the ethnic identity movements, ethnic expression. And sometimes it has taken, or it has started having the certain kind of supranationalist, secessionist kind of perspective. Yet another dimension or yet another perspective which you pick up in the ethnic movements, identity movements, is Aryan and Dravidian identities. Particularly in terms of the southern states, we will finding about anti-Brahminical movements, self-respect movements of Periyar. So these are the certain lines you look at: linguistic, religion, tribal identity, Aryan Dravidian context. So you raise the certain concerns on ethnic identity movements. And when you are looking at the today's, we find about the son of the soil movement, nativistic movement, in which the local identity is being propagated. There has been emerging concerns of the Tamil ethnic concerns. Sri Lanka and other issues are coming out. Khalistan, Kashmir, the concerns of Bangladeshi Rohingya Muslims. It now somehow or other seems that this basic ethnic concern has gone beyond the boundary of the country. And in this very perspective, many of the sociological works, either we are talking about if I could quote one work, that how the legacy what has been left bequeathed by the Britishers is a major cause, particularly in the northeast, that is by H.J. Freddy, who analyzes the historical account of the emergence of ethnic conflict in northeast region, and he considered it seems to be continuation of the British colonial policy of alienation and segregation of the ethnic group living in that region. Though the James Manner argues that historical and accommodative approach was emphasized by the early leaders in the post-independence era in India, the political bargaining, manipulation and coercion to deal with ethnic conflicts continues. It another work that you could remember, Asutosh Varsne, he opines that in some towns, cities, areas and localities, they are more prone to the ethnic conflicts, and therefore we need to focus on the micro level and not merely on the national level incidences. Harrison, Siegel, they will be talking about the regional cultures. Narayan Dutt, Myron Wiener will be talking about the son of the soil movements. You include this one all in terms of the ethnic identity movements. Rajni Kothari asserts that ethnic upsurge and assertions of culture in India are the consequences of excuses of modernization and homogenization trend of the modern states. Thus, Kothari writes that ethnicity is a response leading to reaction to the excess of the modern project of shaping the whole humanity. Though Gail Ombet has criticized such kind of romanticized idea against modernity, R.N. Misra, Shakir, we'll finding about they are talking about the question of regionalism and state politics. Imtiaz Ahmad, he talks about that how the colonial withdrawal from Asia and Africa notoriously bequeathed many problems of group tensions and conflicts to the successor states. So you just pick up that one and talk about in terms of the language, religion, tribal, RN versus Dravidian, the regionalistic concerns, continuation of identity, politicization process. In terms we talk about the instrumentalist approach, and this way the dimensions would be picked up in terms of the certain approaches on the basis of the primordial characters, how they are basically being used for the political bargaining and gain in an instrumentalist approach. That you can bring up this such line in your answers, and that way pick up the ethnic and identity movements. In the movement set, another important dimension has been the environmental movements, environmental concern. Remember it. On the second last session which we talked about if you look at the sessions at the syllabus which have been given in terms of the environmental concern, sustainability, no, we are not talking, we are bringing that one here. Wherever that need be, we will not be talking because that will be becoming more repetitive. So when you prepare the environmental movements, talk about all this thing. When you talk about caste and tribes, do talk about the displacement and rehabilitation. Do not forget where the linkages are there. The challenges before modernity, when you started talking about the very emergence of sociology, the discipline, we basically argued that how the Western Europe, which witnessed a transition from pre-modern to modern, how sociology emerged as a part and response to modernity. That's for the one line. Now we are changing the understanding enough. The way we are looking at the transformation of the human society from pre-capitalist to capitalist, from pre-modern to modern, it has also led to the new crisis. It has also led to the conflicting issues, not merely in terms of the social, political, economic dimensions, but also to the environmental and ecological dimensions. And thus, irrespective of social, religious, political or economic identities, somewhere this transition which has somewhere tried to destroy the very symbiotic relationship between man and nature, the voices are being now raised. If I could quote, that the way the human society has witnessed a transition, it has led to the emergence of new crises and conflicting process relating to the phenomena of rising global collective actions of people, irrespective of their social, cultural and political identities in the defense of nature. Such a defense is also manifesting, signifying a growing consciousness of the collective defeat of human race in the face of its success in science and technology. If I could use the word of Slater, I don't know whether in science and technology you have come across this line, that science and technologies are to be used like a slave, not like a master. Whenever science and technology will become your master, devastating impact of it could be witnessed. So how with the growing science and technology, the technological advancement, what we are now cherishing, it is also posing the certain kind of threats. It is also challenging the growing rationality which has emerged out. And that defeat could now be seen in terms of devastating impact on the nature. It means the entire humanity, right from the international, global, international to the national, to the regional, to the local, everywhere the humanity has now realized the destructive use of technological expansions. And this technological expansion at the cost of a nature. Do you remember Karl Marx? That in pursuit of the interest, man exploits nature, and he not only changes nature, but he also changes himself. So when you're talking about the modes of production, you will be looking at that line. So the technological advancement that is taking place, it is also having its destructive outcomes, destructive use. And thus, a new kind of collectivity, human collectivity is emerging out in defense and protection of ecology and environment. And it is not only a protection. A collectivity is not only trying to protect the environment and ecology, but it is also a redemption. It is also talking about a certain kind of penas. हम थोड़ा पाप धो रहे हैं, washing our sins, that in pursuit of the satisfaction of our needs, with help of the technological growth, the way we have started or we have exploited the nature, it has led to the devastative impact. The way we have damaged and destroyed nature in pursuit of progress and modernity. Now we need certain kind of redemption. And thus all over the world, local, regional, national and even the international boundaries have shrunk to manifest the environmental concerns. In this light, we need to talk about the growing ecological and environmental concerns. And you also pick up one line, the displaced notion of development, misuse of technology, all right, the growing rationality and its impact. You talk about, place that one within these dimensions, you place about the ecological and environmental movements. Particularly in the decades of 80s, you will be finding about that how the relation emerged. The development and environment are not to be concerned as contradictory to one another, rather they are complementary with one another. I don't know whether you are aware of the green movement starting from Germany, the collective communitarian perspective that has started emerging out. But if we go deep, and if any one of you are aware of, you will find about that the term, the symbol green is basically an alternative to the blue and red model of development. The blue model of development was attributed to the capitalist mode of development, and the red model of development was basically attributed to the state controlled route to development or method of development. How this blue and a red method of development has somewhere led a very destructive impact on the environment. Thus the green revolution started coming out, an alternative to the blue and red one, and within which you will finding about it how the ecological concerns will be finding. Charles Rick, greening of America. This very environmental ecological issues will get the political character. So in this very perspective, the certain examples could be picked up. Save the earth. Now we are finding about the tribunals, and we have the different kind of observation, the honorable Supreme Courts. So we are finding about that how we are basically trying to preserve the nature. You could also pick up the Marxian perspective, in which you will finding about that how the technological progress has made man to be in a continuous struggle with the nature. And why we are struggling against the nature? Because we could wrest our livelihood. We could gain our livelihood. And in gaining of this livelihood with the help of the new tools and technologies, how the natural resources are being extracted. But the fact remains that in terms of, in the name of the modernization and development, and mankind basically in a quest to establish a better, rational, materialistic order, has destroyed nature and is destroying nature, is still destroying nature. Irony, look at the irony. In terms of making his livelihood more secure, more stable, man confronted nature. Alright? But what today has taken place? Today the nature is confronting man. Man confronted nature. Today nature is confronting man. And this is the same story everywhere in the world. You pick up the volumes of industrial and nuclear waste, water and air pollution, diminishing forest, dwindling flora and fauna, the depleting green vegetation, degradation of soil, increase in the incidences of floods and earthquakes, construction of dams and displacement of human beings, and how the certain imbalance is emerging out in a biospheric system, loss of biodiversity. You just pick up certain issues within which we will be talking about. In a broadly, I don't know whether you are aware of D.H. Meadows in 1972 bring the publication of The Limit of Growth, a report for the Club of Rome project on the predicament of mankind. Then World Commission on Environment and Development emerged in 1987. And in India particularly, remember that one, in India, the State of India's Environment as Citizens Report 1982 has brought forth the contradictions of growth and erosion of environment. Thus, in the examples of the defense of the planet, save the earth movement, there emerge the concerns for the future of humans. Charles Rick's book, I just said, A Greening of America, and James Lovelock's book, The Age of Gaia. Gaia is the word used for the earth. The Age of Gaia, a biography of our living earth, emerged as the important contribution to provide a scientific basis to strengthen the ecological and environmental movements. Alan Turing in early 80s focused on the struggle against nuclear weapons. So you pick up these issues. Gadgil and Guha in India are of the view that although environmental movements are new, environmental consciousness is a historical fact in India. The early inhabitants have not only worshipped nature but have shown a deep affinity with the nature. However, during the colonial rule with the introduction of industrialization, the exploitation of forest, a new march towards destructing nature began. In this context, Chipko movement, which started in 1973, could be counted as one of the pioneers in environmental movements in India. Ramchandra Guha in the Unquit Woods writes that villagers, in terms of this Chipko movement, he says that the villagers realized together to save the forest near the village. When government forest contractors came to cut down the forest, the villagers, particularly the women in large numbers mobilized by Gaura Devi, stepped forward to hug the trees and prevent them from being cut, which many attribute to the example of ecofeminism. The women who were not afraid of or not knowing the power of the government officials, driven by their own emotions, started hugging the trees and the movement came out. So you pick up that example over there. Also talk about the Vandana Shiva and the Ramchandra Guhas provide a comprehensive ideology of environmental issues by assimilating the social science perspective backed by natural sciences. Madhav, Gadgil and Guha articulate history of graphic construction of changing modes of production and locating the elements of social contradiction and conflict. फिर एक ऐसा नाम सब याद रहे तो L.C. Jain, some of the emerging debates in the Indian context of environmental concerns as we talked about. Centenary and Thukral. If you remember, if you have used the issues of the dams, dam construction in the terms of environmental one, then Sanintry, S-H-A-N-I-N-T-R-Y, Sanintry and Thukral, T-H-U-K-R-L, Thukral, they have analyzed the issues around dams, human displacement, resettlement, and the consequences of tampering with the course of river system. So pick up all these issues, and that way you will be finding about the issues that you talk about in environment. So this way you remember few names, L.C. Jan, you remember the few names, Lovelock, you remember the work which I talked about in terms of Bandhana Siva, you remember this India, the state of India's environment, the state of India's environment, a Citizens Report 1982, isko utalo beta, and then you talk about Gadgil and Guha. Environmental movements are not new, that rather how earlier that has been that there has been an environmental consciousness. So you pick up that one and try to look at this the perspective of the movements on that dimension. So remember this one, that this movement which you are talking about, you just relate that one with the environmental concerns as well, which is somewhere in the 18th or 19th lecture session. You bring it there, do not wait for there, because we are not talking, we will be repeating the same thing. So you just bring that one, and the five which in a brief we have talked about. One is we started with the peasant movements, and then we came to the women movement. We talked about the caste and Dalit and a backward caste movement, ethnicity, identity movements, and environmental movements, environmental ecological movements. So you look at from there, and that's once again I'm showing Singh here. While watching, you do write down names, and only the broader issues they have touched upon. In your language, you would be able to write it, and you will be able to substantiate your answers with the sociological works. So the things will become much more easier in part of you to provide the sociological perspective to your answers. And then tomorrow we will be talking about the next session on that very perspective. Thank you. All the best.